Welcome back to the Return to Virtue podcast, where we go through virtue ethics to help you lead a life of strength and honor. AJ, great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too, Will.
So, we're going to try and sum up the whole of season one today, an ambitious episode. We'll be brisk
Yeah.
and we'll give you a recap of all the main concepts we've covered. If you want more detail, go back over and watch the individual episode addressing it. So, look, first up, we talked about what a man is, what human nature is. And we talked about how we are rational and free. Those two things go together. So this means that alone among all animals, man participates in shaping his own destiny. We have choices to make. And that means we have to think about where we are supposed to get to and how we're going to get there. And basically, in a nutshell, that's what happiness is. Right? We want to get to the right place in the right way so that we are fulfilled as human beings. And that's kind of the starting point for what virtue is ultimately. How can you lead a life like that so you are fulfilled and therefore happy?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking for my kind of opening remarks, I'm thinking about how many people have ever been in like a work seminar or something where they're like, "Hey, if you had to describe in in one word or one idea what's most important to your work, what would you do?" And then what happens? A bunch of people try and think and what would they place as the highest one and there's kind of, it's it, for seminar leaders, it's this sort of infinite game they can always play whether they know it or not, because there's never one correct answer. If you believe in virtue ethics, not even believe, if you come to understand virtue ethics, you realize that you can't put one at the pinnacle. So I'll give everyone a brief background here. Plato, prior to Aristotle, Plato thought that all of virtue could be summarized in one sort of super virtue. And if you start to perfect that one super virtue, then all the other virtues would fall into line. And the main point of Aristotle's work on virtue was to deviate from that idea and say, no, there is not one thing that perfects the human soul toward things, those sort of virtue ethics. It's you have to work on all the different parts at all the different times in all their different ways. That's why the people that are most virtuous are not people who have one trait well. They're the people who, like we kind of said in the last one, are most willing to hunt after their weaknesses. They're most vigilant with themselves in the most areas. You're trying to have as many tools and as many things as you can see in all the different areas perfected. That's going to be, so if you really want to know like what's the starting point for getting good at virtue, it's trying to look for virtue and vice everywhere. And the more that you can see it in more places, the more you can perfect it. Like I said, I just think back to those, again, those seminars, those professional developments, whatever you call them, where it's like they give you that one liner and everyone's kind of stuck there. And then all of a sudden you find yourself trapped in it and you're trying to answer, yeah, what's the most important thing in education? What's the most important thing in finance or in law? And you're sitting there and you're going, I think maybe it's something like someone might say charisma, or someone else might say competence, or someone else might say this thing. And it's not, you could make a little hierarchical relation between the things, definitely you can do it, but where you'll fail is you can never put one at the top. And they know it. So then the person leading goes, interesting. And what do you say? And so they can infinitely go on to the other people. And actually, no one has to become the authority that you listen to. And so then you have to listen to the one leading the little meeting, the little seminar. But all this boils back to this notion of virtue ethics, that you just have to find out in how many ways can you understand the different parts of yourself and what imperfection looks like and what perfection would look like.
Right. I like that you said it's about being awake to your strengths and your weaknesses there, because that's what Christ commands us to do as well. Like, stay awake. You have to keep your eyes open and look for all these areas where you have to exercise that caution so you can cultivate the right character traits. And the
Yep.
thing about us having free will and being in pursuit of happiness or fulfillment is that this has to be willed. Like, you've got to exercise that faculty. And the question is whether it's going to be something that really is good for us, or whether it's something that is only an apparent good. And we might take things out of context, the correct virtuous context for them, and become obsessed with the pursuit of pleasure of the palate, for example. Like, it is a good, but not in the way that we're using it or pursuing it. So that what we're really trying to get to in the end is our supreme good. And in a way, those seminar leaders, they can't do this because normally it's all couched within a secular worldview where the idea of objective goodness makes no sense anyway. But we can actually answer what happiness ultimately consists in as Christians, and it's that the supreme good is God. And if we're not doing something that helps us get to heaven in the long run, why are we doing it?
Yeah, and this is also where Thomas Aquinas perfected Aristotle. It's not just that he relayed Aristotle. He made, as Aristotle would lay out, there's sort of four causes. This is the metaphysics of what makes up a thing. There's sort of four causes. There's the formal cause, the material cause, um, the
Efficient
final
cause.
cause, and the efficient cause. I was thinking of efficient. But the final cause, the last one, is why you're doing a thing. And he says that the final cause is actually the first in intention. So the end is the reason why. Okay. All right. So Aristotle lays that out, and then he goes and tries to say, well, what's the final cause of happiness? What's the purpose of happiness? What are you trying to get to? And he got to something like, sort of contemplating the transcendent. But you notice he means that sort of in this life, right? That you would achieve a level of sort of contemplation of sort of divine union in this life. Well, what's the Christian tradition going to do? This is why Thomas actually perfects it, because he comes and he says, effectively, very simply, oh yeah, Aristotle just wasn't clear on the beatific vision, the nature of heaven. Not to his fault, but by divine revelation, it hadn't come to him, and he wasn't aware of it. He says, so the actual ultimate happiness is to dwell in heaven. We talked about this really early on, and maybe I hit on it more in the episode on charity, right? When the will which desires a thing and then uses a thing, it tries to conform to what that thing is, to what that object is. And so if it's a transient good and you conform to it, think a cinnamon roll that you love, or a pint of beer, or whatever in between. As your will uses that thing, as it conforms to that thing and uses it, what happens? The thing dissipates and it's gone. And in some sense, that is literally happening in every transient thing that's not God, even your wife or your kids or things like that, right? You're trying to conform to it, and it can't, because even them, they have this transience, they have this contingency, and that's where you start to see, oh, the only object that could properly fulfill that desire would be something where the object is itself eternal,
Yep.
where it can never pass away, it can never go away. So now we can actually see how the object itself is going to determine for us the answer to this question, and that object has to be God. And that's where Thomas Aquinas can say it with that level of clarity and
Yeah.
directness.
Whereas Aristotle reaches the halfway correct conclusion that happiness consists in philosophizing about the divine or thinking about God. Aquinas says, no, look, God is a person, truth is a person, and your happiness consists in an eternal friendship with him in heaven. That's what you're made
Yeah.
for.
Yeah, and that
So,
and that actual grasping of God is given to us in the afterlife, not because we know that or we figured out, but because God has told us. He
right.
has revealed that to us. He has made it known to us that no, if you are truthful, you will enter into the heavenly kingdom and you will receive God. You will become the wedding guest of the marriage feast of the Lamb. You will be there. You will now have it. Now we see dimly, as in a mirror, but then we will see face to face, as St. Paul says. So that divine revelation supplies us with that answer, which is, no, this isn't just an abstract idea. You will literally get it, right?
Yeah.
And so that's going to be that distinction where Aristotle's groping at it in the dark and making out a ton of the contours, and that's amazing that he did that by the
Yeah.
strength of his reason. But no, the answer becomes something just much clearer. And by the way, when you furnish the last end, the final end, it makes everything else clearer and easier to learn along the way.
There's that great line in the old fashioned penny catechism for kids that explains this so well. Why did God make us? To know and serve him and love him in this life, and to be happy with him in the next.
Yep.
So I love that
Be happy
distinction.
with him in the next.
In the
Yep.
next, right? But
Yep.
it's the serving, it's the hard work of virtue in this life, and be happy with him in the next. So it's just a really deep, profound point there that adults need reminding of as well. Penny
Yep.
Catechism. If you've never read that as an adult, just sit down. You can get through it in an hour or two. And there's just so many bangers in that, just like that.
Yep.
Happy in the next life. Okay,
Yep.
now the reason we can talk about virtue in this way and say, whoever you are, that's where you're heading if you want fulfillment. That's what happiness consists in for you as a human being. You can't say that what will make you happy is just hanging out in the forest with the brute animals. That's not what you are. That's not what your nature is suited to. So, natural law means that because of our rational nature as human beings, there are like laws that mean human nature is the same for all men in all times, in all places. And that's a kind of external guide to our conduct. So, what does a good human life look like? Natural law tells us it's going to involve all kinds of things that are the same for everybody. You don't get to invent what is good for you from scratch and have it being radically different from what's good for everybody else. And you've also got, as an internal guide for yourself, your conscience too. Like, we can't escape
Yep.
from either the external reality of human nature or the internal reminder of how we're supposed to live.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, Will, if I were to synthesize it's not the point that you're making here is, you guys, there is an objective reality to this. This is not just, and that's an important one to break through, to pierce that veil in our modern day where it's so much in the water that it's arbitrary and subjective. We're saying, no, there's a real, it's not what do you think about this thing? It's what is the right thought about this thing? That's a different approach
Yep.
in general. And I think that's really what you're getting at, which is like, that's the starting point, is first off, that just understand, hey, there's arguments for why
Mm-hmm.
it's this objective reality, many of which you just furnished us with, right? And okay, so now that you're there, it's like, all right, now get that sort of obstacle out of the way, that barrier of like, am I going after my happiness or my version or this thing? It's like, no, you're going after happiness. You're going after this sort of objective
Right.
reality that, and by the way, if the criteria is objective, then you can be critiqued according to that objective criteria. And
Yeah.
so then you can actually grow and perfect yourself.
Yep.
And you don't
Which
know
is
if you're just playing a
liberating.
mind game. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Because you don't know if you're playing a mind game with yourself or something.
Yeah. That phrase, you do you, or don't judge me. It sounds like it's freeing, but it actually leaves guys spinning their wheels in this horrifying mess where they have no real reason to do anything rather than anything else, because it's all up
Yeah.
in the air. There's no blueprint for what success actually comprises. But the way you've explained it there, here's a plan, here's a blueprint for your life. And it's not you do you, it's basically you do God's plan for you, because that's the best
Yeah.
thing for you. Understand that. Ask for help about how to implement it. You've got the 10 Commandments, for example, which give you like another buffer against straying off into stupid dead ends. So they
Yep.
clarify a way to live individually and also socially. You got the teachings, all the precepts of the church as well. You can follow that too. So guys like to have systems and lists and clarity, and God knows that, and He's given it to us. So you don't need to be confused. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but at least it is simple in a way. It's simple and it's hard, and you should thrive when told that, rather than try to run away from it and retreat into confusion and murkiness again.
Yeah. And recall these principles that we've talked about so often about our human nature, about us having a rational intellect. It's a very imperfect tool. You guys, you got to think of it like this. Like, we have the weakest of all intellectual apparatuses. And what is the source of that weakness? It passes through our bodies. through our senses, our organic brains, and these things are frail and they're weak and they forget stuff and they don't see things with perfect clarity. They don't even come close to seeing it with great clarity. And so when Will says that it's simple, it's clear, you can study it, you can learn it, don't think of it like a computer that uploads the data and okay, now I got it. It's a process. This is why there's actually intellectual virtues, which we didn't go into at length in this season, but the intellectual virtues are habits. They're what could be called something like a cast of mind, where you're inclined to look at things in a certain way. You're inclined to study and rethink about things and redo it, re-encounter it. That's largely even what we're doing here in this episode. Will and I have spent a lot of time thinking about all these virtues. We've taught on them for a number of years, and here we are, we're talking to you guys. And as Will would know, as a teacher, anytime you come back to a subject, it's slightly different because you have to re-rehearse, you have to redo it, and we're talking about now we're re-rehearsing it. So that's the real key, is like it might be something, rather than being like, hey, learn the commandments and learn the virtues, it's like meditate on the commandments,
Hmm.
meditate on the virtues, reflect on them, be always thinking about, do I got it down, is it sharp, could I prove it right now, could I get into a conversation right now and do it. Will and I go through all of it, and then what do in the lead up to this episode? We go back and review our notes. We go back and re-look at them, because it's like, okay, yeah, you're constantly trying to re-rehearse it. You want to be all like if there's an aspect of the virtuous life that's really valuable, it's that you're always thinking about it. uh,
Yep.
St. Paul says it, pray without ceasing. For me, I've always heard people be like, pray without ceasing. That's like, man, how can I get there? How can I do that? People do it at retreat, Catholic retreats, things like that. And I will say, from my time of conversion, it's one where I'm not saying that I've reached the highest levels of divine union and prayer and mystical contemplation. I'm not there, but I'm always thinking about God, and I don't see that as my work. It's me getting myself out of the way to let God work. I just am always thinking about virtue, about God, about formation, about how you can communicate it, about how you can love each other. Just first add that into the repertoire, where it's just everything. Cultivate that hunger. And by the way, if you don't have the hunger, this is what I did when I first became Catholic. There were a few sins where I confessed to them because I'm reading, hey, that's a sin. And so I would confess the sin, and then I'd follow it up with a confession that, and I also want to confess the fact that I don't feel sorry for having done that sin. And I pray and ask God to give me the sorrow in my heart that I will need in order to perfect whatever that thing is working against. Right. So
Yep.
if you're sitting there and you're going, I don't feel that I have that hunger, pray for the hunger. Pray for the hunger to have it, and then start reflecting on it over and over and over again. So that's the thing, right? A life of virtue is someone who gets inundated
That's
with
such a
virtue. They're
deep point.
always thinking about it.
Yeah. What AJ just said there is so important. I think Aquinas talks about the difference between attrition and contrition.
Yeah,
Like,
he does.
you might be scared of being punished and going to hell for something, but really you want to get to the point where what you're most sorry about is having offended God, infinite goodness, with your sin. So even if you're at the point where you are sorry for what you've done, but it's mainly because you're afraid of being punished for it, you can still pray to actually get contrition, like
Yes.
sorrow for
Yes.
understanding how you've offended God. So that's a great reminder, AJ. So much of what you said there was about the importance of habit. And that's really
Yep.
what virtue is. Virtue, to sum up the whole of season one, is to do with habit. What kind of traits are you building in yourself? That's what virtue is about, when they are good traits that are going to help you find fulfillment, help you get to heaven. Vice is basically bad traits, things that are going to destroy you, weaken you. So when we understand that virtue is about habit, and being human consists in having an intellect and having a will, because those are our specifically human powers. It's why you're
Yep.
different from like a tiger or a lion or whatever it might be. We see that those habits consist in the intellect or the will. So you got to think about your intellectual life, also about your moral life too, and your sense appetites, what AJ was talking about, the way in which our intellect has to work through our senses, they are also involved in this habit area too, because you got to control them. You have to bring them under the control of the intellect and the will. If those are running riot, then it's going to interfere with your virtue formation. So we got to look at two things basically: um, intellectual and moral virtues. What
Yeah,
do
and
we
when Will
know and what
when
do we will?
yep, and when Will says moral virtues, just a reminder for everyone, those are the virtues that perfect the will. Intellectual virtues perfect the operations of the intellect. Moral virtues perfect the operations of the will. And a lot of those then will graft onto our sensual or passion operations, but it's the will toward those things that has to get perfected. And I might throw one more rejoinder in there, right? Because both vices and virtues are habits. They're sort of repeated acts that one does. The categorical distinction between vices and virtues is that vices are animated by desires unreflected upon. So the desire goes to the thing, and then that desire creates the habit. You do it over and over again because the desire moves it. A virtue is something more like you have a mindset of what you're trying to do, which animates the act. So they have to always be rational, right? We've said this in the early episodes. Virtues are rational, vices are irrational, meaning they don't vices don't take mediation by your reason in order to be done. Now, what happens with vice is the desire irrationally moves it, and then you come to justify it. So you actually then distort your rationality. Now so someone might think, well, I have reasons why I think I should have sex with as many people as often as I can, or jerk off as often as I want, right? That they've made a reason for it, but it's an irrational reason. It's detached from, and why is it irrational, right? Well, because it's detached from the nature of what you're using in that case, which is a reproductive system. If the system is called a reproductive system, it's for the telos, the purpose of reproducing, right? And you can do the same thing with the digestive system. These things, right? You're not trying to undermine the nature of these things if you are being rational. You're irrational if you're undermining the nature of the things. Okay, so again, vice, desire moves it, and now you make these irrational rationalizations,
Right.
these ego rationalizations of why you're doing it. Whereas virtue starts with the proper rational ordering toward that thing. And at first, your desires are not going to feel like they're there. Like, oh man, I'm really having to work against it. It feels strenuous. It feels painful. Because anytime you have to work against your desires, there's a sort of pain that comes along with it. And then over time, as the reasons really ground and you realize how true they are, how good they are, they go the whole way, you can keep applying them over and over in situations, then you get to the place where eventually the will submits to the
Right.
reason. At that point, then you have peace toward it. So
Yep.
that point of peace, which by the way, you might early on go through a few phases where you're like, oh, I think I found the peace. But once you do find it, it'll be totally calm. It'll be totally settled in. You won't have to count the days of how long it's been since the last time you did the thing, because now your mind will be ordered away from it. And 2 years will go by, then 5 years will go by, then 8 years will go by, and you'll be in the exact same boat. So give it time, but it'll prove itself. And at that point, then it's like, okay, that was the acquisition of virtue in that area. And now
Right.
you got to move on to the next thing.
Yeah. I like that description of the peace that it involves because it really brings out the way in which it's like a permanent good disposition towards
Yeah.
acting that way. So when you are enmeshed in a vice, you've got a deep bad disposition that's stopping you from attaining the truth or doing the good. And virtue is just the opposite. So you act in accordance with the truth. You want to know the truth and you also will it as well. You're not stuck there rationalizing whatever bad behavior you've fallen into. And it's so true what you said about the impulse forming the habit and then the intellect trying to rationalize it, even to the point where, and you made this great observation about Luther, they just end up denying that the will is free at all because
Yeah.
it's just so painful to recognize what a mess they got themselves into otherwise.
Yeah, I think I've read it from someone. I think it's more of a contemporary, probably last 100 years or so. I want to say that could be wrong, but I read it from someone, and it stuck with me that like the acquisition of virtue. I mean, it's definitely drawn in root form from Thomas, um, but the acquisition of virtue is the movement of the desire toward an area to a higher place. It's not, that's why it's not false. That's why it's not shaky or vulnerable, is because what you really are trying to do when you use your reason and you give yourself the mindset of how you're going to approach it, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, let's take food for example. I'm not going to order myself toward food or towards sex in a way that is higher, that it's more in line, right? But now you don't have that entrenched yet. So once you have that habit entrenched, then the impulse toward the lower version of that same desire toward that same object now dies. It goes away. And then this becomes a thing. And then that's why it's actually stable and secure, because you're like, once you have that, you're like, well, wait, I don't want to go back to the lower version. Now, the real point is you have to understand it and see it in a way where you'd actually get there. A lot of people have these sort of you know, infantile versions or something, these sort of beginner versions of virtues where they're seeing, their mindset is seeing the thing, and it's not yet sort of consummated, it's not yet seeing it in its full beauty, so they're actually just getting it partly wrong. So they're trying to perfect their attitude toward food, but they're working from not perfected principles. So they're
Hmm.
kind of like, okay, I want to be healthy. Well, yes, it's good to be healthy, but that can spiral into vanity.
Yep.
And so they don't yet have it refined to the right place where the virtue is really high. So it's basically like they're here, they're trying to target this thing that's just a little bit higher, and they're trying to get it, but then they keep bouncing back. And what they're trying to do is realize, okay, well, there was something in that I needed another piece. And then all of a sudden they get to like, oh, hey, now I'm looking at it from here. And now it's a little bit harder for them to bounce back down because they got a little bit more gap. So it's going more like this. Then all of a sudden they get it right where enough things click and they're like this. And they're like, oh, wow, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go back and forth between this. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I using that visual there, but that's kind of the idea of it. It's now over time you get to this place where, oh, it's up here. And it's like, yeah, I'm just not worried about going all the way back down to that really base view
Yep.
of sex at this point, because frankly you also then come to understand how it spirals all these other areas and these other
Right.
agonies and despairs, and you're like, yeah, you see the direct connect through to it, and you're like, yeah, I don't want that. So that's where we always say this is where Thomas Aquinas talks about the new law, which is based in Christ, opens us up. What it does, and you've talked about this. I've reflected on this so much about Pascal and the psychological value of arguments. Right? It's like, okay, do we know? Can we know that we have an immortal soul? Without Christ dying and resurrecting. Like, yeah, we can know it, but his death and resurrection is so psychologically valuable in clarifying that for us. Like, you can think of it, there is this sense in which Christ's actions are sort of verifying these things that are real, they were there, and yet here it's happening, and he is doing a real work. That it's not just a psychological mechanism, he's doing a real work of real substantial atonement of man so that we can be reconciled to God. But it's also helping us. That's the profundity of it. It's doing secondary goods as well. It's helping us along the way so that now we can see these things, trust in them, and start moving toward them as if they are real. And then when we move toward them, they actually come into fruition. So Thomas Aquinas says that the difference between the new law and the old law is based in fear, and the new law is based in love. It's the same 10 commandments, but they're taught to do them because they don't want to offend God. To now God has come and shown the glorious generosity of his love. And so now you can say, oh, I don't just want to not do it because God is so powerful and he can hurt me. I want to do it because God is so profoundly beautiful and I want to never be separated from God. And now, guess what? This is actually the antidote to our modern Catholic Church and the struggles with the sort of philosophical liberalism and other things that modernism that have creeped in to the church full fledged. The actual answer is, imagine if they said, hey, commandments 6 through 8 isn't real. We've abrogated them, right? We have the power to bind and loose. You're no longer bound, all right, by commandments 6 through 8. One who has been formed in virtue would say, frankly, I don't care if you say that, because the thing animating it wasn't this fear or this me, begrudgingly going through like, oh, I guess I can't do this. It's animated by love. I want those things. So even if you took it away from, even if you said you don't need to do that anymore, I still would want to do it. And that's where, by the way, that's the actual answer. And that's actually why the church will hold its course or set its course right. If anyone tries to deviate, whatever way it has to go, it will set it right, because the basis of love grafts onto these things, and it doesn't graft onto the other ones, and it won't ever be able to, no matter who tries to say it. It
Right.
will.
That's really interesting because whereas Plato was wrong to think that there's one super virtue that we can develop and solve all our problems with, he was onto something with that line of thinking, because although there are different
Yeah.
virtues, they're all interconnected. The health
Yeah.
of any one of them does indeed depend on the stability of all of them. So the moral life is a whole in the way that you're describing there. So you can't just be good at one bit or hope that there are just some areas where if you're sufficiently strong, your weaknesses in all the others don't matter, because they really do. You might be a judge, for example, and maybe you have developed the virtue of justice to a high degree. But if you're afraid to sentence the criminal in a way that is just because you're worried what the press might say about you or the protesters outside, if you haven't got that fortitude to
Yeah.
bring the hammer down and say what you know the just truth is, give the sentence, then guess what? Your deficiency in fortitude is stopping you from actually showing your justice. The two
Yeah.
things are going to stand or fall together. And it's true in all areas in the way you've been outlining there. And this is why when we looked at the four cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, we were explaining some of the links between them. And we basically got prudence, which is like it's an
Right
intellectual.
reason. Yeah. Right reason
Yeah,
applied to action. Yeah.
exactly. So it is an intellectual virtue, but it's described as a moral virtue because the matter of prudence is about how to live a moral life. So it's like a
Yeah.
bridge between the two.
It's about how the will applies what it understands.
Exactly. So
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking you just by highlighting that interconnectedness of it, I just was thinking about, I had this sort of image of like, if you're trying to get good at something, and now this is really human, and this speaks to both levels, why we have to perfect them individually and why we need it as a whole. All I could think of was like the professional, soccer player, footballer, as you guys would call them, right? Imagine you're trying to build a new skill. You're going to develop a sort of a hesitation go right. So you hesi at the ball, and then you tap him to the right and you go around him. Okay, well, when you're trying to acquire that skill, you got to work on that skill in a vacuum. But if you don't then integrate it into your whole arsenal, if all you do every time you get up to the ball is you hesitate and go right, you're going to start to get whooped by the people you go against. So that's the nature of virtue. We have to spend some time looking at the individual thing. We have to go into the lab with it and work on it. The hesi right, the hesi right, the hesi right, over and over and over again. But then the point is you're not trying to only have the one move, because you also need to spend the time in the lab doing the hezi, juke right, go left. You need some counter to it, some
yeah,
counter to it. And then you do it with another set of moves where you're like, okay, I've got this next set of moves that I use that have both moves and counter moves built into it. And so now you might have, by the way, probably the greatest footballers probably only have 3 or 4 sets of these. They don't have 75 sets of them. They're not the guy who you see them do all the dribbling tricks over on the side. Most pro footballers would be like, sure, maybe I could do it. I probably could do it, but also maybe I could get really perfected, but I don't care because I'm just going to beat you. And there's these other things at play. But they might have 2 or 3 sets of move counter moves. But they had to develop each one in isolation, each pair together, integrate that pair, and then try and add in a new pair. And now all of a sudden you get to a place where your game is now operating at a way higher level. And if you can move within those 3 sets of, move, counter, counter move, something like that,
yeah,
now you're destroying people. If you can then have, but here's the key, right? What is then going to open the doorway for that? sort of nexus of moves, do you now have the physical strength, the stamina, the mental wherewithal when you get beat? So now you add that underlying layer, right? Another thing that you have to sort of perfect and cultivate on its own. And when you start to get that, and now you got the move things, all of a sudden it's like you start to realize it's actually not a crazy leap to become a professional. There's certain barriers. Some people are going to struggle with move acquisition, but a lot of them are going to struggle with refining those underlying things, the strength of their body, the stamina, the mental disposition toward competing, toward loss, toward
Yep.
humiliation. You get those things down, you can just now you just got to ride it out. If you're not, a Premier League player right now, you'll get there, because guess what? There's what, I don't know, you probably know 18 teams in the Premier League or something, and each team probably has 22 people. Okay, so what's that? 18 times 360, 400 people in the Premier League. You only got to be one of four. You don't have to be one of one or one of 10. Trust me, I know that number seems small, but if you get those skills in line, if you got the goods like that, like, it's going to come. So you can have that patience and be like, whatever, politics games coaches want to play at the lower levels, like, it's nothing to you, because you got it. You got it. Well, it's the same. It really is the same thing with virtue. It might not pay out to your success right away, but if you got it, it's coming in one way or another. It might not be paid out in money, but it might too, and it might come some other way, and it might, you know what I mean. If God gives you money, it's so you can build up His church, your
Yep.
community. If He doesn't, it's so you can continue perfecting other things. It's whatever situation you're in, you're winning.
On that
You're
on that
doing the
money
thing.
point, just about something I know a lot of guys struggle with, especially when they are looking at having larger families and all the rest of it, is what if I don't earn XYZ, whatever it is? What if something happens to me that's bad financially? And Aquinas makes this point too, which is that everything that's happening to you in God's providential plan for you will be used somehow for your spiritual benefit. So you might go
Yeah.
through periods of like material desolation, psychological, emotional pain, and thinking, why is this happening to me? But if you hold fast with fortitude and understand that the toughest part of fortitude is often the endurance and not giving up, that there's going to be some reason for this, and you can hope that God's got this and He knows best for you, then it will all work out for your spiritual good, which is far more important, because ultimately it's about how you can improve spiritually, what's going to help you to grow in virtue. A guy wrote a
Yeah.
guest post for my Substack recently talking about a business failure, and he went from earning 400 to 500K a year in e-commerce sales. He thought, you know what, I'm working very long hours, 12, 13 hours a day. I should start my own business and make it so that I get a higher ROI, can spend more time with my family. COVID hit. The industry he was in,
Mm.
travel and logistics, was good for a while, and then just like the bottom fell out of it. And it was a financial disaster for him. And the whole time he was thinking, why has God allowed this? I'm going to lose my house. I can't feed my kids, all the rest of it. Turns out none of that happened. Like, he got through it just about. And I was asking him, okay, so would you do it all over again? Would you go through all that pain again? He was like, you know what? I would, because I'm a better husband and father now as a result of this. And I can
Mm.
help other guys in business because of everything I've learned. I was put through this tough experience and it's made me grow mentally and spiritually.
Yeah.
So even that, what looked like disaster, and he talked about being awake at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., like in night sweats from anxiety. Like, why is this
Yeah.
happening? Even then, there was a point to it. So that's what fortitude can help you to do, is hold fast. And we were looking at those individual virtues. Look, AJ's just described how there's a kind of prudence that a pro soccer player can develop. And you're going to need to develop that prudence that suits whatever your state in life is. And you also need that individual prudence for just your day-to-day interactions with people. Maybe you're a politician and you need like political prudence too. So be on the lookout for those particular skills that you need for what you do in life, how you serve other people. You can always improve there. If you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, brain surgeon, whatever, you develop that prudence for that particular duty. But then apart from that, individual virtue of prudence, which is like the ruling or the guiding virtue. We also looked at temperance and fortitude. And
One,
yep,
hold on, let me throw in one comment. I was just, when you were talking about the money and the guy, it's
yeah,
one of the, I'll say this, one of the scarier prayers that the Lord drew me into, he baited me into. It's from like Proverbs chapter 29 or 30. Lord, make me neither rich nor poor. And at front, you're kind of like, okay, cool. But then all of a sudden you realize, like, all right, well, dang, I'm not poor right now. I kind of would like more money. But this prayer is like, make me neither rich nor poor. So you get the good side of it where, okay, I don't want to be poor. But you also get that side that's so hard for the ego, which is like, wait, don't make me rich either. Wait,
yeah,
am I really asking for that?
yeah.
It's a hard one. Like I said, to me, that's one of the most daunting prayers. I found myself reflecting on, like, wait, I'm asking God to not make me rich. And like, because we always talk about, is it bad to be rich? Like, no, not in principle, but
For most
dang,
people, it
here's
is.
this for most people. Yeah, no, like I said, not in principle. It's not, but
Yep,
in practical reality, for
yeah,
nearly all of us, it probably is going to be,
yep,
and so again, it's in Proverbs, like I said, chapter 29 or 30. At the end of the month, I'm
yeah,
always
yeah.
reading it, and
That's
it's,
why
Lord, make me neither rich nor poor. And it's, that
Christ
one's tough.
warns about how hard it is for the rich man to get into heaven. And that's because those apparent goods become so pressing that it's so easy to
Yeah,
get attached to them. You have to be extraordinarily virtuous to be very wealthy and also to keep your heart detached from it. And
yeah,
Father Ripperger makes this point as well about the litany of humility. He's like,
yep,
if you really want to pray that and you want to pray for humility, like get ready. That's serious. You don't
I
go
know.
into that lightly
My
because
my parish priest said the same thing. I started praying the litany of humility 3 years ago every day, and my parish priest goes, and he's an awesome dude, younger priest, and he goes, oh man, he's like, I don't know if I can do that one, because God's gonna help give you the things to make you humble, and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like, because it's it's just you, but you're doing it every day, and it conditions you.
yeah,
It really does. So you guys, you can look that up. From the
yeah,
desire of being esteemed, deliver me, Jesus. From the desire of being loved, deliver me, Jesus.
yeah,
From the
yeah,
desire of being
yeah,
extolled, honored, praised, preferred to
yeah,
others, consulted, approved. From the fear
yeah,
of being humiliated, despised, suffering rebukes, calumniated,
yeah,
forgotten, ridiculed, or dismissed, wrongs, suspected. That others may be loved more than I. That others may be esteemed more than I, that in the opinion of the world others may increase and I may decrease, that others may be chosen and I set aside, that others may be praised and I unnoticed, that others may be preferred to me in all things, that others may become holier than I, provided I become as holy as I should. That's the litany of humility. And there's some response ones that you do all through the way.
yeah,
Deliver me,
yeah,
Jesus, and then at the end, grant me the grace to desire it. But I'd encourage, I mean, yeah, it might be scary, but it's the right thing for you. It's the right thing. I said to my priest without hesitating, yeah, no. It might be scary, it might be hard. But the whole point is that you're trying to get to the humility that
yep.
will allow you to more deeply unite to God,
No,
right?
no
Whatever comes.
masculinity without humility. So that's why that pride that's in you and the saints warn about, and even towards the ends of their lives, as developed in virtue as they are, they're always like, be on the lookout for pride. The litany of
Yeah.
humility is just striking at the core, which it feels like a gut punch when you go through it. Sometimes, like some of the lines, they just went through the whole thing. Like that really goes to the root, and pride is in all sins. St. Gregory makes this point: is it's the root of all sin, but it's also in all sins too. So the litany of
Yeah.
humility just goes in there.
The fear ones, from the fear of being forgotten, being ridiculed. I always say ridiculed or dismissed, so that both of them are there for me. From being wrong, from being suspected, from suffering rebukes, from being calumniated. So people, I don't even know if I pronounced that right, but
Yeah, yeah,
people gossiping about you or slandering you. I mean, those things hurt when they're doing it, and you're asking, hey, deliver me from the fear of that.
yeah,
Be willing to accept all of that. It's
yeah,
like, man, some of them, that others may be loved more than I, that in the opinion of the world others may increase and I may decrease. It's like, wait, we're actually asking to decrease, not just that others get their shine, but actually decrease me. It's like, dang. And it's like, okay, what's the wisdom of that? Why are you praying for that? Because you're starting to recognize. I always say, like, man, the Lord, the Lord knows me. It's like I get good things going, and there's just challenge after challenge after challenge, and there's doubt and there's fear and all these things that come into this just these things that I venture into. They feel so difficult and they feel so burning. It's like the Lord knows me, because if He let it go good for like 3 weeks, I'd probably be like, no need for God.
Yeah,
Knowing my
exactly.
vanity, I'd be
Yeah,
like, you get if the Lord gave me like a month straight of just like no hiccups, glory, like this is going good, people like me,
yeah.
I'd be like, all right, we're good. Like,
Yeah, yeah. That's
and it's
it.
like, no, but he's going to be like, no, you got to have enemies. You got to have people distressed with you, that the accusations they're making against you have to have some substance in reality. So you constantly have to be reflecting on it, going to that confessional, figuring this thing out. It's like, man, I just think about like, God's got me.
Yeah, yeah.
He's got me, because
Yeah.
I would run haywire with this. You give me, I swear, things go good for like 3 days and I feel the tension loosen.
Yep.
And I'm
That's
like, I'm easing into it. I start projecting out like, oh man, here's how the next 30 years can look. Here's what I'm going to be able to build. And
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
talking like it takes me probably 72 hours of
Yeah.
things, like some good things happen, some good news coming, you start to mount it. And I'm like, oh man, I'm going to be able to make this impact and this thing, and I'm going to be able to reach these people. And, Saint AJ, here I come. And then
Yeah.
it's like I said, it takes me like 72 or 96 hours, and I'm doing that. And so over time, I just reflect as they keep coming. I'm like, Lord, you know me better than I know myself.
Yeah.
Please keep drawing me, because when the struggles come, I got to lean on the Lord. I got to lean on the Lord. And now, luckily, He's helped me. So I'm getting more of the habit to it. Like I said, what I'm just even saying to you here, that's a realization that's only come to me in the last 6 months. It's like, okay, but now I can be armed with that going forward. Like, I know I need this. I need that. It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
not I, but Christ.
Yeah.
If I'm being dismissed or ridiculed, it lowers me. It raises up Christ. Good,
I
good.
it's an important thing to know about yourself too. You know it just from knowing human nature, but to know it about yourself that you got a specific tendency there. I have it too. And having that humble mistrust of saying, I probably can't handle that. I'm going to trust that whatever's happening is the right thing. God's plan for myself is wiser. It's better than my plan for myself. And the litany of humility with what you were explaining a moment ago, we can see why it's so important in today's political climate, because you have to be willing to endure a lot of that bad stuff and not be afraid of it if you're going to
Yeah,
actually speak the truth as a Catholic man with boldness, because people will say all kinds of things about you: bigot, transphobe, hater of this,
yeah,
hater of that. Like, it all comes. I had every single name you could possibly call me, I think, when I was
yeah,
fired. And it's got to be like, yeah, whatever. I'm not afraid of what the mob's going to say. St. Augustine makes his point, like, if you can't
yeah.
stand up to the mob, you can't actually stand up for God. So part of that is just having the humility to be able to go through it and not have your pride, your ego so wounded that you would rather just try and maintain that reputation in the eyes of people whose calibration of what makes a good reputation is skewed anyway. Like,
Yeah,
you shouldn't
yeah,
care what their opinion is.
yeah. And it takes that, like, as Will even said it there, I just was thinking, he's like, and that's what you need, is the humility to take this on. It's like, in practical reality, even the humility to take this stuff on is something that you're gonna have to fight for in each moment,
Hmm.
right? And it's like, it's still gonna hurt. I mean, these are social assassinations that people are throwing at you with these terms.
Yep.
And that's gonna sting.
Yep.
you know
For
that
sure.
that knife cut's not going to come in and be nothing, but you have to be able to look at it and go, okay, where they stab me, it's not in a vital organ.
Yep.
you know they stab me in the arm, they cut off
Yeah.
a finger, it's like, okay, I'm not dying because of that.
Yeah.
All right,
and
let's
and
keep going.
maybe like someone like
It'll
E.
hurt.
Michael Jones,
I don't.
you can say stuff that means you might not ever be able ever again in your earthly life to be able to work in some institutions, move
Yeah.
within some social circles, right? That's gone forever. But you have
Yeah.
to recognize that if you were there, if you were biting your tongue to stay there, that's spiritually dangerous for you. You're better
Oh
off
yeah.
out of it. They've closed down on you. They've brought the barrier down and they've removed themselves from your life. And God knows that's what's best for you. So that's the mindset that you need to have. What's happened to you might hurt you on some level, but it's okay on the deepest level. And what you're saying there
Yeah.
about needing to pray to actually get the strength to go through this, that's what you can learn from the saints' lives. And you got to understand that the real humility is recognizing that the the virtuous life isn't something that you can actually build all by yourself. It needs to
Yeah.
be divinely infused. And we talked about the supernatural virtues too, theological and moral.
Yep. And I'll throw in too, guys, you'll start to intuit the the logic of the Eucharist, the principles of the Eucharist that the church teaches. Okay? The Eucharist, right? If you don't have that right sort of instinct toward your sin, your sinfulness, then it won't quite make sense what you're doing with the Eucharist. Okay, you must approach the Eucharist in a state of grace. Okay? That's true. But as Thomas Aquinas relates to, it is the analogy that's used is that it is nourishment for the body. Okay, think about it like this, the spiritual body. What it's really doing more than anything is it's trying to help preserve you from sin. I said it to someone the other day because I like to use these images. My mind just thinks in these sort of abstract sort of conceptualizations. I thought of it like something like this, like sin is like this disposition toward a thing that when something in time happens, you're more likely, sin is the thing that will grab onto it and it'll tie a knot around the thing. It won't just kind of smoothly go along with it and move along with it. It's like time happens, an event happens, and the sinful person, boom, they're constantly grabbing on and they're tying these knots and they're tying these knots over and over and over again. And what we want to get to is where we tie lighter and lighter knots, where it's just a little tiny thing, because now we're maybe talking the distinction between venial and mortal sin. And you're going to confession and things like that. But part of the Eucharist is you're saying, "Dear Lord, preserve me from grave sin until I come before your altar next." Right? That's part of that prayer that you can make after communion, after Mass, is, "Dear Lord, thank you for the grace to be here today, to bear witness to and receive your body, blood, soul, and divinity into my soul." Right? And now you can say, "Lord, preserve me until I come before your altar next. Unite me ever more deeply to yourself. Keep me coming in and going out all the days of my life, forever and ever. Amen." That's a prayer that I've mashed together from some from some from a psalm, which is, "Keep me coming in and going out all the days of my life." Some from other things, just observations. But this is that notion of the Eucharist, right? Is that, okay? It's also helping preserve me from sins in the near future, because when you start to understand yourself rightly, you go, "Yes, I know that I've sinned, but I also know I have this tendency toward it." Right?
Mhm.
It's like when you're really early on, your disposition is going to tie these huge knots around things, and you have to really be courageous and enduring and persevering in those early phases to just take on the sort of psychological weight of
Yep.
your life now that you're looking at it. Now, the whole key is, as that torment is happening, the torment's not the sin. It's just those knots that were tied. You were more likely to sin in response to them, to
Yep.
hate your neighbor. Oh, they hate me, I'm going to hate them. Right?
Yep.
They insult me, I'm going to insult them. Right? And so you're taking on, you're just trying to refrain yourself from sinning. But you'll see these knots that were tying that before you used to sin, and it's almost like that then welded that knot shut. When you sin, it would weld that chaos shut. And now
Yep.
you're trying to get to a place where over time, hey, these sort of my disposition, it grafts onto it much more calmly. And when you come to that perfection and virtue, you get to that place where now all of a sudden it's like, oh, as those things happen, that sinfulness in me isn't latching onto that.
Yeah.
But
The-
man, that is a long and arduous process, and there's no
exactly.
injustice. This is the thing you could take to the bank. There's no injustice in the moral life. Anyone who grows in virtue grows in it justly. That's crazy. That's a crazy thought right there. God's justice is so perfect that if a person is not doing the right things, they will not be able to grow in virtue. Virtue can only happen to the one who is doing the right things. It's not like, some wicked people get virtue. No, wicked is fundamentally incommensurate with it. There's rich people, there's other designations of things, but you can't be wicked and virtuous. So
Hmm.
there's a perfect justice in it. There's no like, hey, that person's smarter, so they got virtue easier. No, there's literally none. The mathematics of it are perfect.
Yeah, everything follows the law. And when you talk there about how difficult it is, that brings us to the theological virtues that we rounded up season one with. And
Yeah.
you got to think about hope here, which is that yes, it's difficult, but you need to trust that it's possible. God's not going to
Yeah.
command you to do anything impossible. You might feel that it's impossible at moments and it goes too deep, the knots are too tight, there's too many of them. But if you pray for the grace to be able to resist temptation and you trust that your salvation is fundamentally a matter for God to work out, like rather than you,
Yeah.
because you can't
Yeah.
do it. You can't save yourself. You have to just go along with what the plan is and trust that because he's omnipotent, that if you are faithful, he can help get you to where you want to go. But you're not doing it by your own power. So hope, we said, was that firm desire for a difficult good. Getting to
Yep.
heaven will be the hardest thing that you have to do in life, but it's ultimately the only thing that matters. And that's what having that hope really entails. And then alongside hope, we had charity and faith as well. And charity is the love of God for the sake of loving God. Think of it as
Yep.
being like friendship, and that's why charity is the one of the three that is going to persist in heaven as well, and will just deepen and deepen for eternity. And we had faith, and this was so important for me in my early 20s, starting to figure out what faith really was, moving away from this idea that it's where you shut your eyes and wait till you feel a certain way, and that's what faith
Yeah.
is all about. Like, you switch your intellect off. No, instead it is an assent of the intellect to the propositions of God, like to what he's
Yep.
revealed, because they come from God. So you can figure out with Aristotle all about the unmoved mover. You can deduce things logically about the nature of the unmoved mover, which is basically what gets you to classical theism. Then within that philosophical framework, you can get to Catholicism specifically, looking at the incarnation, the fact that considered purely as a historical document, not assuming it's revealed, the Bible shows that Christ was God and founded an infallible church, right? At no point have I said, the Bible looks to me like it's revealed. I just treat it as a historical document. Then the Catholic Church tells me that the Bible is in fact revelation. And I'm like, okay, cool. So now I know that. But it all started with just my own reasoning faculties. God's working with me all the way, giving me the grace. So I'm being pulled towards faith. But there's no weak link in the chain there rationally where I have to shut my eyes and hope for the
Yeah.
best and just believe blindly. And so then everything else that I can't actually figure out and plumb the depths of properly with my own natural reason, the Trinity, for example, I just take on faith, right? But the faith itself is rational because I know that God, who is truth himself, can't deceive me. So that's where faith comes in, but it's fundamentally based on reason. It's not a blind shutting of the eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking here, as you said, it's not a blind shot. Like where we don't see it, where you don't see it, like how does that work out? Like at those times, it's like the ascent of the mind is in part what builds over time is with it is a sort of trust, the sense that okay, you're right, maybe I don't see the link through here, but what we're holding out for, and this is kind of what the Protestants, the reformers kind of distorted here, when we're holding out in the interim, we're holding out for God to reveal what those propositions are with clarity. I remember
Mm,
when I was coming into the church, the animating principle of me coming to church was I believed that Jesus was God. I learned about the consubstantiality clause, its historical significance. I had the background where I'd been meditating on Christ, on his figure, how he was distinct from other world, gurus and historical figures. He more profoundly inclined, he more profoundly provided an antidote toward like despair than the others. Why? I've said this before on the show, but because the other ones, become prominent people in their communities. The Buddha is really esteemed for 40 years, held in highest regard, and Muhammad becomes, effectively a king, and Moses had the deference of most of the Israelites, and like those are good things to have. So a person could naturally just desire to have that. But Christ gets abandoned by the people closest to him, turned over to the authorities falsely by one, and then killed. And so not many people can retain a sort of natural desire for that life path, right? And so it is like there's a distinction there. But so then I learned consubstantiality clause, and I believed, okay, Christ is God, and for me, it was easy connection with the church, which I always say I'm Catholic or nothing. I think either God formed an institution that it would be able to, in the same way he incarnates and becomes a human, so that we more intuitively and instinctively can interact with him, because we're actually ordered toward most profoundly toward interacting with other material objects that are humans. So in the same way he met that sort of visceral reality, he would have done the same thing with an institution, because that's something that mediates human interaction so profoundly. It's uniquely human. And so to me, it made sense that it would be all of this or nothing, or it's just this little game that we're playing.
Well,
And so for me,
infallible revelation necessitates an infallible authority, like body, to promulgate it. Otherwise, what's the point?
Right. No, and again, I'm even going a level deeper, where I'm a level lower, where I'm just saying the visceral reality of humans is that we interact with institutions. So there would be some sort of flaw if God was like, well, I'll meet you as an individual person, but nothing else that's human. Like, I'm not going to touch institution. And it's a real struggle that Protestants have. It's why it develops such a deep-seated anti-institutionalism. I mean, that's really in the water of the sort of youth rebellious spirit nowadays, is that we're anti-institutional. And the thing is that, like anything, these institutions need renewal and purification as well. But so again, to me, it's like there's just this sort of visceral reality that, like, okay, why wouldn't God hit on all the different levels? And the Catholic Church does it. It's the same way you guys, I've heard you and Tim talking about it with like the papacy. It's the same thing. It's so viscerally observable or assentable that leaders, that people follow leaders, that people who they look up to, that you need one person who leads a charge, or who can make decisions, who has a jurisdictional authority. They're very primal things, and you have to be willing to step outside of connection with that primal reality to start making arguments of why there's not a leader, why there's not. And I get it, there may be profound intellectual weaves that people are tying together, but at bottom, these are the things for me, they come together. Okay, so what I really want to lay out here is, though, all right, so I know I'm becoming Catholic, but like many of you, I didn't get the claims around sexual morality. I didn't understand. I didn't see, hey, why do they think that? And I can tell you guys why also. Well, the barriers that stood in my way are probably the same barriers that stand in most people's way. Well, the argument that our secular lustful society came up with is like, well, your desires emerged all on their own when you were 5 or 6 years old, didn't they? So then they emerged that same way for people who have deviant sexual proclivities, right? It's the same thing. When they were 5 or 6, they just emerged. Like, this is the argument for it being born into someone, that they're born with a disposition. And so at first I was like, I just don't get what the claim is, how this could be right. Like, right, if someone's born with a disposition, a sexual disposition, then how could there be any fault or sin involved? And so the first thing I had to unpack was very thoroughly why that's a half argument, why that's a distorted argument, right? And here, I'll give you guys the actual example. When I reflect on my life, my first yearnings of my first crush that I had on a girl, in the first grade. I still remember what her name is. I won't say it because she's living somewhere, but when I first had a crush, I would imagine as a first and second grader, so that's a 6-year-old and 7-year-old, I would imagine having a family with her one day. That's what my imagination was. My attraction to that girl was that we could be parents, like my mom and dad, we could be mom and dad, and we'd have kids. Okay, so it was fundamentally, utterly bound up in family. There was no version of it which was, oh, I just want to sleep with that. I didn't even know how the kids would be made, right, at that point, but that was what the yearning was. So it's not even accurate to say that, well, you just had desire for girls. No, I had desire for family,
Mm.
for children, right, for life in its full. For them, I still remember, I would imagine what it would look like for both of us to be waking up and be parents and helping and do things like that's where my imagination would go with those things. So no, you have to kind of unpack these things, and you have to say that, no, actually, I didn't just have this lustful desire when I was 5 years old or when I was 6 years old. My first inclinations toward girls that I was attracted to weren't lustful in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
There was none of it. And so now you start to unpack it, and then you start to go, oh, wait. And then what about, like, when you get in habits of porn or masturbation, what happens for every single person who gets in them? They track to different deviancies, right? They don't start there, they end up there. And now all of a sudden you start to realize, okay, yes, there's a deepness, there's a depth, there's a layer of this stuff that's sort of hidden from our conscious awareness in the early moments as we're just acquiring these vices. But these things are fluid, and they're fluid to profound degrees. And then all of a sudden, now it was unpacked where now when they talk about the virtue of chastity being the ordering of sexual desire toward love and toward children, now I had the tools in place where now I could grasp it, right? So at first, like you said, you might be reading the scriptures, you might not know how it clicks up, but it does click up.
Yep.
It does click up, and the different teachings, they do click up. There will never be a point where you have to abandon reason in order to go along with a thing. You just might not yet understand what the argument is. And
Well,
I'm in that same boat. There's certain things that I'm studying where I'm like, I just don't yet understand what the argument is. And then you go into it, you dive into it, and you try and figure it out.
and it comes back to what we were saying about natural law earlier on and how everything is going to be rational and connect. And if you join us for season 2, we're having a short break, but in season 2, we're going to look at the importance of dogma and what AJ is saying there about how everything holds together, everything connects. Dogma is a way of actually ensuring that kind of consistency. So don't think of it as
Yeah.
being something that restrains. It's actually something that enables us to think, right?
Yeah.
Dogma isn't going to hold back thought, it's going to deepen it. And we'll explain how if you just like pull out one of the pins, then the whole thing comes down eventually.
Yeah.
So, like with denying that the Virgin Mary is actually the mother of Christ, for example. Like, if you deny that, then okay, let's follow that out. Guess what? You're going to end up denying the Trinity if you understand
Yep.
what you've just done properly. So the dogma ring fences thought in a way that actually helps you to think logically and deeply and ultimately get to the truth. But I hope today's episode has helped giving you a useful recap of the material from the first season. Go back over, look at individual shows, and share them with your friends too. And we'll be back again soon to explore the importance of dogma for season 2. AJ, it's been a real pleasure. I've looked forward to it
Yep.
every week. I'm looking forward
Same.
to season 2 as well. And I'm so grateful that we had the chance to do this together.
Yeah. Peace, brother. I loved it.
God bless. Take care.